Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Queen Mary and welcome to the Mile End Institute. My name is Robert Saunders. I'm the co-director of the Mile End Institute. So before I hand over to our panel this evening, I just wanted to say hello, to tell you a little bit about what the Institute does and to advertise a couple of other events that we have in the coming weeks. So the Mile End Institute is Queen Mary's Centre for Public Policy and for Research. And what we try to do is to tackle big issues of public policy in a way that draws upon wider academic research, and in particular the research that's happening here at Queen Mary. Of course, there are a few bigger policy questions at the moment than those relating to data. Who controls it, who has access to it, how we regulate it, and so on. So it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome our panel this evening to talk about this wonderful book, which I'm sure you will hear more about shortly, on data politics, worlds, subjects, and rights. We do also have two other events coming up in the next couple of weeks. A week today, on the 18th of November, we have an event called What is Corbynomics? The New Political Economy of the Left. We didn't know this was going to happen during a general election. You know, these things take years to prepare. But we have some really interesting speakers, both from inside the current Labour leadership and what might be thought of as more critical voices from outside it. So if you want to know more about Labour's evolving economic policy, then please do come along next Monday. That's at 6:30. Then on the 5th of December, we have an event called Britain Adrift, Britain's place in the world after Brexit. So if you're wondering what the world is going to look like if and when we finally leave the European Union, then please come along on the 5th of December. We've got a really interesting panel of speakers who have very different views on where Britain should be looking and how it should be thinking of maximising its influence in the future. So please do follow us on Twitter or on Facebook. If you visit our website, you can sign up to our mailing list. All of our events are free, and we would love to see you at more of them in the future. But for this evening, we're very much looking forward to the discussion on data rights, and I'll hand over now to Engin to introduce the panel.
Thanks very much, Rob. And I just want to start by thanking both Rob and Tim, my colleague Tim Bale, co-directors of Mile End Institute, as Rob mentioned, for hosting the event. It's really a pleasure to be able to organize an event through the Mile End Institute, which is based in the department where the school that I'm based as well, School of Politics and International Relations. I also would like to thank, before we get going, Sofia Cusano and Mina Akhtar, who've been just absolutely great in organizing all the logistic details and various aspects of organizing the event. They've been just fantastic. I just want to thank them. Now, this event is not necessarily about the book, but it revolves around the book and its main concepts. We have published this book, we have put together with my colleagues, Evelyn Ruppert, who's also in the audience today, our co-editor, and Didier Bigo, whom we were expecting today also to be here, but unfortunately he is ill and he couldn't make it. So the three of us put the book together, particularly in thinking about the emerging data politics. Data is obviously a concept that we often hear, but we wanted to take a broader and a different look at the conception of data politics and its related developments. We basically meant three things with data politics in the book. One is the international politics for data rights. Typically what happened in the last few years, that we have had access to issues, or we have had issues with privacy, access to the internet, anonymity, oblivion, data oblivion, being able to be forgotten by the net, or ownership that many people are engaged with. These are typically new conceptions of politics on what happens to data that's been accumulated by using ubiquitous devices and being always connected to the internet. Even those of us who think we are not connected to the internet, we are indeed connected via various means. It doesn't necessarily mean that only those who continue to keep devices in their pockets and only do computer work that are connected to the internet, but anyone who does banking, anyone who has employment, anyone who has any connections to administrative and other governmental bodies, being a subject of state, subject of international organizations today really means being data collected over any of our activities. So that's one meaning of data politics, international politics of data rights that emerged in the last few years. But there's a second meaning, politics carried out through means of data is also an aspect of data politics. An example that comes to my mind is Ni Una Menos, not one woman less. It's a movement in Argentina that builds a national index of male violence. The uniqueness of that data politics is that this national index of male violence, what women's movement in Argentina has been able to do is to identify, bring a particular object into being that Argentinian government and Argentinian authorities are not necessarily recognizing as an issue. Systemic male violence in Argentinian society. And then there's the international replications of this particular index. So this is an example of a politics carried out through means of data. And then there's a third kind of politics where some colleagues, I don't know if Nina Dengic is in here today, but one of our authors also in the book that we were expecting tonight, they call data justice. That brings two types of data politics together and then brings issues about data justice, similar to social justice, environmental justice, gender justice. They begin to talk about issues of data justice that combines these two types of data politics. We have set out this notion of data politics in the book and speak about and feature various chapters that touch on these different conceptions of data politics. But tonight, when we were organizing the event, I was particularly interested in inviting Elspeth and Jennifer because they have they're coming at the question of data politics from different angles, and both angles really speak to different conceptions of data politics that we wanted to feature in the book. Elspeth is going to speak about broader issues of particularly what happens when many of the issues that arise with data politics cross borders, and how do various people actually make claims to data rights across borders by putting together various international regimes of law and regimes of human rights into work and create really new type of data rights claiming that cross borders, and she's going to speak to that. Coming from a different angle on data politics, Jennifer is going to speak about particularly carrying out politics via means of data, particularly environmental sensing and citizens' intervention with generation and accumulation of data. Not so unsimilar to the one that I mentioned on the National Index of Male Violence in Argentina, giving a different interpretation on production and accumulation of data by citizens. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in succession now, and then they're going to take each a few minutes, 20 minutes or so, to introduce main elements of discussion, and then we're going to open up for discussion. Elspeth, I'm really pleased that she is able to make it tonight. Elspeth has been a long time friend and colleague, and she's a Jean Monnet Professor of Ad Personam at Queen Mary Law School here. And she recently delivered her valedictory lecture at Radboud University in Nijmegen after 22 years of teaching also there. She's also a partner at the London law firm Kingsley Napley, and earlier I was just reading her valedictory lecture, and I recommend, it's available online. It's a short piece, her reflecting on her career since she finished her PhD, which was entitled Moving the Borders of Europe. And in some ways, she's reflecting after 20 odd years, after having completed the work, the immense work she has done on the question of asylum seekers, refugees, migration questions in EU law, and the major contributions she has made. She comes to full circle and she says, I'm actually still quite with this theme, moving the borders of Europe. And I was thinking, actually, she has quite contributed to moving the borders of Europe in terms of our thinking about the questions of Europe and European migration. And Jennifer Gabriz is also a colleague and friend. She used to be at Goldsmiths and sociology department, a professor, but recently moved to University of Cambridge. She holds a chair now there in media culture and environment. She continues to have her affiliation with Goldsmiths as a visiting professor. But Jennifer has been leading an ERC, European Research Council funded project since 2013, which we will hear more about, called Citizen Sense, which is an investigation into the public engagement with environmental sensing technologies and citizen data generation in both urban and rural locations in the US and in the UK. And I do think of it as a really prime example of the second type of data politics that I mentioned, citizen-produced, citizen-intervened forms of data politics. The project has already received multiple awards. So we are really in good hands today to open up various aspects of data politics for us to have a really productive debate. Without further ado, I want to just hand it over to Elspeth first. Thanks very much. I forgot to mention that the book is available as an open access for you to enjoy. Yep, it's there. Just forward.
Ah, okay, right. Thank you so much, Engin, for such a generous introduction. You know, it makes me feel like I'm going to have to be seriously interesting to live up to the expectations which you have you brought into existence with this fabulous introduction. Yes, I hope I'll do justice to such an introduction. It was a wonderful project, this one, that Engin and Didier and Evelyn put together, and it took a couple of years, but it was really cutting edge. You go through the table of contents of that book and you think, oh yes, these are all of the questions I had about data, about the politics of data, but in such a wide variety and range of ways of looking at it. One feels that you really have a whole field covered. Of course, each of our contributions is limited to what we had to say and what we saw from each of our individual perspectives. But the total is amazing. It's really an astonishing piece of work. And I think that it sets a threshold for the study of data as a subject, perhaps even a sub-theme in a variety, or a transversal theme in a variety of different disciplines, which deserves to be dealt with in an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary manner. So I'm going to look at this really from the perspective of how we have become data citizens. And this is not a presentation designed for jurists, so you don't have to rush for the door. This is kind of a wide-ranging look at how data has changed who we are, what we are, how we think about ourselves, how we interrelate to others, and how we participate in the regulation of ourselves and who we are. So we've called this, and this was really Engin's first comments on my chapter, were so helpful on this. He said, well, you know, what you're really talking about is you're conjuring into existence something that you might want to call a data citizen. And I thought, oh, that's such a great idea. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. That's exactly what I see happening. And what is a data citizen? What does it mean? This goes back to much of the work that Engin has done over many years about how does citizenship emerge? How do citizens emerge? Through struggles, through claims, through the maintenance of their ambitions and their life stories. And it fits very well with this idea of data citizens. We are a body of emerging data citizens. So the first question which I have to contend with is what data and whose data? And from a legal perspective, these are two very different things, because what data can be data about objects, it can be data about cows, it can be data about trees. And that data has no privacy implications. It's out there, use it if you can. You will enter into a whole series of debates if you are in the life sciences about access to data that people have created through their experimentation and whether you can have access to it. But the idea is, what is this data? Well, it's data out there. From our perspective, it's data. Then we have the question about whose data. And as soon as you get to the question of whose data, if it's data about cows, it's data which belongs to the person who collected that information about cows or trees or whatever it is that they're collecting data about, rocks. But if it's my data, if it's data about me, a human being, that all turns on its head, because data about me is a special kind of data which we call personal data. And in the context of Europe, at least, through a whole series of different mechanisms, the idea of whose data is personal data is an extremely contested concept. But the bottom line is that data belongs to each and every one of us. It doesn't matter who collected it. So many people are out there collecting data. Data is being collected on me right now as I give this presentation. But that data fundamentally remains mine. I have a choice about what is done with that data. I'll get to that in a second. So that's what we mean when we talk about privacy. Personal data and privacy. We say you have a right to protection of your privacy, terrific. And what has that got to do with data protection? Well, it means that the state is obliged to set up systems, data protection systems, which protect my privacy, our privacy as individuals. And then you have the question about, well, who's transparency? Who gets to look at all this data? What about transparency? Well, transparency is not a concept which you can put into a dualistic opposition with privacy. Because transparency is about governance. Governments aren't allowed to do things which are not transparent. Governments have to require companies to publish their annual accounts, etc., etc., etc. Transparency isn't about me as an individual, my privacy. Transparency is about the way in which we're governed and is an inherent and important part of democracy. So every time you hear the whole question about, well, you know, there's an obligation of transparency and you may have a right to privacy, but we have a right to transparency, so we have a right to know who you are. and then you suddenly find yourself in the world of the right to be forgotten. The transparency, you should remember, is about public bodies and about economics. It's not about us as individuals. Now, this is all very inconvenient for many people and many organizations, both state and non-state, who want to use personal data. There's heaps of it floating around out there, and it's jolly useful to run some algorithms through it and to come up with all kinds of super duper stuff. I went to a conference in Helsinki, and we did a field trip to Tampere a couple of weeks ago. And while I was there, my phone, of course, was automatically downloading the podcasts that I tend to listen to, right? So when I got back to London, I was listening to my latest version of Brexitcast, and the advertisements were in Russian and in Finnish. But I was really amazed that they were in Russian. They must have picked that up when I was in Tampere, and they were in Finnish because I was when I was in Helsinki. Now that means that there's a little algorithm running around out there that every couple of seconds is telling all of the people who are selling advertising on these podcasts where I am, and therefore in what language they should be targeting me. And of course it was all about targeting me with boots, really, really thick boots to keep ice and snow out. So we have the question about who am I? Well, I may be British here, that makes me a citizen according to the state here. But when I was in Finland, I was of course a foreigner, all right? So do I have the same right to privacy as a foreigner in Finland as I have in the UK? What kind of a person am I? What kind of a citizen am I? Can we say, well, of course, for the moment, the UK and Finland are both in the European Union, so maybe I'm a citizen who should have equivalent rights. Or is there a differentiation? And this is a point of exceptional disagreement between the United States and the European Union. The United States says, no, 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 no. Citizens get a higher level of protection under our Constitution. Foreigners, we don't give a toss about them or their data. The private sector can do what it wants with them, let alone us. So you have this question about what data. I've already dealt with the human, non-human. If you're a dog, sorry, you don't have a privacy right to your data, or at least not yet, not recognized in law. If you're human, you do have some kind of privacy right. Do you have it, is it a form of personhood, or do you have it as a citizen? And that takes me to the third part of the introduction, which is territory, state, and legal orders. So we have this idea, well, somehow your right to privacy is territorially bounded. Does it belong to me as a citizen in a particular territory? When in Finland, that means I get my advertising in Finnish or Russian. And of course, because my advertising is coming in Russian, that means that across the Finnish-Russian border, there is a completely different set of regulations about who's allowed to have access to whose information. So clearly, the advertisers are using a whole territorial scheme, which is based on their ability to make reaches across the Finnish-Russian border. The state, in the UK primarily, I get my advertising on my podcasts in English. And the question about the legal orders, whose legal orders, and how far do they reach? Where do they go? So, the first question is, how do we order this personal data? And now I'm getting a little bit juridical in a very EU-ish kind of way. And the first thing is data creation. How do we create data? How does it come into being? Well, we do things. We do things online. We fill in forms. If any of you have ever filled in a form, a visa form to come to the UK, or you know anybody who has done, you can ask them about the tremendous amounts of personal information which they're required to give to the Home Office to get a student visa to come to the UK, and about the final paragraph on that form, which says that they authorize the UK government to share all of their personal data provided in that form to anybody, state or private, anywhere in the world, should they feel it was in the best interest of the United Kingdom. So you've given away, they've created all this data, they've made you create all this data for them. They have put it in their database, and then what they've done in that final paragraph is they have contravened what's called the purpose limitation principle. That when you create data, when you hand over information about yourself into a system, that system is required to use that data in accordance with your wishes. So why did you allow your data to be collected? Why did you participate? Online, make a phone call, send an email, whatever. What was the purpose? There is the purpose limitation principle that it is you who gets to decide. So, question mark, is that free use paragraph at the end of British visa forms valid or invalid? Is the British government entitled to say the purpose limitation principle does not apply to any data which a foreign national has created and sent to us for visa purposes, and we can use it for anything we want, or can't it? And that question remains a very big one out there in the world of the legality of data use. We know that under US law, there's no such thing as a purpose limitation principle. Data belongs to the entity that collected it. Then we have the problem about data connection. What about connecting up data, one database with another database? The big future of data politics is the use of algorithms to find out information about us, to give us what we want. And the bigger the database, or the more databases that can be connected, the more accurate the information will be. So we begin to have data doubles who are floating around out there. And we have to ask the question, well, in whose interests does this take place? Is this in our interests? And to what extent does the purpose limitation principle apply? Data ownership, who owns that data? Is in the public sector or in the private sector? And the conversions between the two, a classic is passenger name record information. Every time you take a flight, you have to fill in all these piles of information for the airline. And the public sector in a number of countries, the US and the EU and about 6 others, have agreements that they're entitled to access to this data for the purposes of pursuing serious crime and terrorism. But the problem with those two terms is that they seem to be very loosely molded, allowing a very wide access to data. And then we have the question of data use and transfer, and here's how it becomes transnationalized. So you start off with your PNR data, passenger name record data, every time you get a flight. The airline company subcontracts out to 5 big multinational companies the collection of all your data, including, did you book a special meal? Did you order a car hire? Did you make a particular choice to sit next to somebody else? All of this data about you. And they keep it for commercial purposes. They say this is consistent with you having bought a ticket from them. And the states that want to use passenger name records say, no, we need it for serious crime and counterterrorism. So they enter into agreements, and suddenly your data is being transferred back and forth from the private sector to the public sector across borders. Primarily to the US is the biggest consumer because they have the most capacity and they're the most interested in this data. And they say the purpose is to create no-fly lists, to find people who they're looking for, etc. On the other side of the conundrum, and what I would say about this transnationalizing of personal data, and particularly about personal name records, is that most people who fly will be nationals of the country they're leaving from, and then they will be, when they come back, nationals of that country coming back in. So what happens with personal name records is that it gives the authorities of that country the power to gain a whole lot of information about their own citizens that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So you suddenly have overcome the whole problem about the citizen-foreigner divide by turning the individual into a passenger. And as the passenger comes back home, the passenger's data will be collected. what emerges from this? Well, not everybody is wildly enamored of this. They're not, all of us think that the move from the purpose limitation principle to a free-for-all about our data to be used both by the public and private sector is really what we had in mind. It wasn't what we would like to have done. And this is where the data citizen emerges. So where are we going to find those rights? What are these rights going to be, and where are we going to find them? How is this data citizenship going to emerge out of this field of data sharing, personal data collection, personal data use, where you have the private sector absolutely convinced that this is the new golden age. They're all going to get super rich out of this. You know, and you know how quickly we go from, oh, you can't make any money on the internet, to, oh, the internet is the only place you can make money, and all this back and forth. So we have no idea. Does it make money? Does it make money? We'll leave that aside for the moment. And we have the public sector, which is to a certain extent, in a race with the private sector to know more about the people on its territory. So all kinds of things which the public sector is unable to find out about us, or certain parts of the public sector are able to find out about us, they can find out about us through the private sector. So for instance, we have very strict rules about, for instance, access to our tax records. HMRC has very strict protocols about not sharing data with other government departments. The NHS has traditionally had very strict protocols not to share personal information with other government departments. How do you get over those obstacles to get your massive database, which the Home Office wants? Well, part of that is the story of the Windrush, but part of it is also this story here. How do you go about getting there? So we have exceptions, and I've already given you two of the exceptions. The exceptions which we find in the legal frameworks are serious crime and terrorism. These are the ones which are normally used in the international agreements. So how wide can those be as exceptions? And then the question is, who wants to defend privacy rights? And how can you go about defending them? Where does the pushback come in this whole story of what is happening to our privacy and the protection of our personal data? So we then go looking for places where we can try to get our data better protected. And of course, the first place that we go, whether we're Schrems, the famous Austrian who's brought all the cases before the Court of Justice of the European Union on the right to data protection and to privacy, established a whole series of rights for us, including the limitation, the establishment, the upholding of the purpose limitation principle. But we start off, and we always start off with our national legal order. What have we got here that we can work with? Are there any rules? Well, the strength of the national legal order, or the weakness of the national legal order, is that it can be changed. So, assuming that companies that have a huge interest in using data are sufficiently successful in lobbying members of parliament, legal protections can be diminished. The strength is implementation. If a law is passed protecting your data in the national system, you usually get pretty good implementation. We have the Information Commissioner's Office. She's been taking a whole series of actions to try and help us to get better control over our data. We have regional legal systems. This is the Council of Europe and the European Union. Both of them have been very busy and have been very susceptible to the arguments of us, the data citizens, saying, wait a minute, this has all got way out of hand. We have not given our consent to a whole series of companies, of states to share our data, to do what they want with it. And we think this is very dangerous. We have in criminal law, for instance, the principle against the police going on fishing expeditions to search to find out whether they can make anything stick on you. No, they're supposed to investigate crime. The idea that states can now go in and just look around and see whether anybody fits a profile that they've got for the purposes of serious crime or counterterrorism, we find problematic. So our two regional regimes have been very active. We have the weakness is state compliance, so we have to get states to agree. The EU is better on that in terms of getting state compliance than the Council of Europe. And we have the problem of these vested interests which have become very powerful. But we also have the robustness of the human rights framework, so the European Convention on Human Rights, etc. And then we have the UN level, and that's where the data citizen has really come into her and his own. After the 2013 revelations by Edward Snowden of massive amounts of snooping on a lot of us by a US intelligence agency, a number of countries were pushed by their citizens at that time. Germany and Brazil were in the front line. Brazil has now stepped out of the shop, but Germany still remains in the front contender in the UN, saying this is inconsistent with the right to privacy. And states are not permitted to snoop around and collect up massive amounts of data about everybody and run algorithms through it as they wish in search of whatever they want. And of course, one of the subsequent revelations from the Snowden revelations about the snooping was the extent to which data which was being collected through multinational mobile phone links, etc., was being used for the purposes of targeting persons in respect of whom the United States then carried out extrajudicial killing, and there have been a number of those frequently and very high-powered. So the place where the international community gets together is, of course, the UN. And the UN, in the General Assembly, asked the UN Human Rights Council to provide an explanation of what the right to privacy is in a digital age. They came up with a report in 2014, which was adopted by the General Assembly, and which establishes that both citizens and non-citizens have equal rights to protection of their privacy, that our personal data remains our personal data, can only be interfered with by states in accordance with the exceptions, that private companies must respect the purpose limitation principle, all of the kind of good stuff that I've been talking about here. So the first thing that happened then was that you see a number of venues emerging, such as the International Bar Association, and others saying that there is no agreement in the international community about what is the right to privacy. So an attack on the use of the UN as the forum within which the international community expresses itself by a series of interest bodies that wish to say no, the international community is not in agreement over this particular principle. The second argument that we get is that we have all voluntarily given up our right to privacy. We put ourselves out there on Facebook, we put ourselves out there on Instagram, and therefore we have given up our privacy, so we're not entitled now to complain when other people use our personal data. That, of course, is a very specious argument, because the whole business about which level of friends you have on Facebook, which causes best friends to become worst enemies, is an indication of no, this is not personal data which is available to everybody. We are sharing it with a small number of people. And then we have the question about enforcement. Everybody says, well, how are you ever going to enforce this? It's all hopeless. It's all out there. It's too late. You're closing the stable door after the horses have run out. And to them, the argument, which is the pushback argument, is that's what they said about consumer protection. Back in the 1960s and 70s, when you bought a washing machine and it broke on the second day, you had no consumer protection. We decided that was no good, and we had a transnational movement of consumer protection. And now if you buy a washing machine and it conks out the next day, or it blows up in your sitting room, you have your consumer protection rights, which you are entitled to exercise against companies, whether they are in your country or not. And if we can do that in consumer protection, why can we not do the same thing to protect our rights as data citizens? And that is the end of my presentation.
Well, I'd just like to second my thanks to Engin and to Evelyn and to Didier, who's not here, for this fantastic collection, which really does do not only a comprehensive but quite incisive investigation of data politics. So I heartily recommend it, not only because I have a chapter in it, but because it really does, I think, capture the field in quite an effective way. So as Engin mentioned, I'll be saying a bit about a project that I've been working on, Citizen Sense, which does resonate more with the second way of thinking about data politics, which is what happens when citizens make their own data. We've heard from Elspeth in quite a kind of eloquent account of the right to data and different kinds of questions that come up when data is often collected about you. So I want to think through what happens when citizens are generating their own data, what sort of rights claims they can make with that data, and whether this potentially also reinvents how we might think about rights, for better or for worse. So data is often something that we think about as something that data companies are collecting about us. But here, as I've shown this overview today, I want to think about citizen data and data citizens, how they emerge, but also rights to data, rights as they're in the making, the uncertainty of rights, and how these rights are reinvented. So we think about social media platforms, different kinds of ways of collecting data in relation to, for instance, flying, as Elspeth has mentioned, as ways in which data is collected about us. But citizens are doing as much to produce their own data, especially in relation to environmental projects. Of course, we've heard about the database of male violence. There are many databases like this as well. But here's a way in which citizens are using environmental sensors to collect data, in this case about air pollution, where they're trying to use evidence as a way to make more livable worlds. So they're often using this data to make claims also about the city. So this project's been running since 2013, and the work that I want to talk about today is something that took place in Southeast London, where we looked at how citizens were organizing to do monitoring, and how when we gave them monitors such as these dust boxes here, they were able to create their own data sets and to document conditions. So they were able to generate their own data, to analyze their own data with the toolkit that we made, and begin to make claims about what was going on in the urban environment. And you can see some of the sites where people were monitoring there. So during the monitoring period, people were documenting traffic sites, they were looking at construction activity, and they were proposing rights to data, I would suggest. This is not data through, rights through data in the sense that they're looking for the right to privacy and so on, as we've heard about, but about a different set of citizenships that emerge through collecting data. So what are the ways in which this citizen data operates? How does it potentially supplant the usual ways of thinking about rights? And how can it also be mobilized as a way to engage with the urban realm? So I want to think about the kind of political subjects that emerge there and how they use rights to data, as well as a whole set of other rights that come up here. So we've heard about the right to privacy, the right to be forgotten, the right to data protection, and so on. But how could we think about data citizens as they're collecting data and also articulating a right to clean air, the right to monitor environments, since this is not something that's actually legal in all countries. In some countries, you're actually not allowed to do this. In fact, it was challenged in the US. There was a case in Wyoming where people were brought to court for documenting Bureau of Land Management activities, and it was held up under the right to free speech. Also the right to environment, the right to the city, the right to data, the right to participate, the Aarhus Convention, articulates specifically in relation to environmental information. So there are many rights that we could think about as emerging and being articulated through people's practices of collecting data. And some of these rights are also established in law. For instance, the right to breathe clean air is in various ways upheld and observed within some urban environments, for instance in the EU, through instruments and objectives that establish a legal right to a certain standard of air quality. There are guidelines for the sort of air we breathe. But as we all know, living in London, just because we have the right to clean air doesn't mean that that's actually enforced. And so there's a question about what happens when these kinds of legal victories can occur, for instance with Planet Earth taking the government to the Supreme Court, but nevertheless pollution persists. So this is where citizen data comes in as a way to potentially try to uphold these rights, to try to hold governments to account, and to also generate new sorts of rights in the making. So this is a phrase that I borrow from Henri Lefebvre, who talks about the right to the city, and how rights are not necessarily always settled in law, but instead are potentially in the process of being pursued through conditions of possible democratic engagement. And here this very much resonates with Engin's work on citizenship in the making. But looking here at how rights in the making occur through people's use of these data producing entities, these different devices that people can use to generate data about air pollution. So here you can see in Southeast London conditions on the A2, where people are quite concerned about the data, the pollution here, and they have collected data previously to document that these are pollution hotspots. And here's where they are looking at how to uphold their rights to clean air, to make claims about what's going on in the city, and to not do this simply to communicate a standard set of evidence, but to instead challenge the official readings and to provide different insights. So by citizens collecting data, they're not merely showing a number about pollution exceeding a certain level, they're also capturing a whole set of processes that are potentially overlooked within the usual way, the regulatory way of collecting data. So that's to say that by challenging regulatory data, there are also different data ontologies that emerge through these different data practices. So the right to data articulates a right to the city, as well as a right to clean air, and the right to make livable worlds. So in this sense, it's kind of pushing toward different ways of being in cities. So this is a way of potentially pursuing what Lefebvre has called the right to the Ouvre, or in other words, the right to make the city as a collective work. So this is suggesting that rights are also ways of proclaiming that people want to be able to shape the city. They're not merely passive receptors to thinking about how to comply with political and social life, but they actually want to make the city as a more livable space. So this is different from a way of thinking about more abstract rights of citizens, and instead is suggesting that rights are something that reinvent ways of living. And this is a way of thinking about rights as prospective, as much as a potentially more declarative rights claim. So here's a way of thinking about how data citizens materialize through collecting data. They're not citizens potentially in the usual sense of thinking about citizenship through belonging to a nation state, but rather they're citizens who emerge through political acts that are articulated by collecting data, and also by analyzing and communicating that data, and making claims about urban processes, but also by making proposals about how the city should be and how we might live in the city. So the right to data is not merely here an abstract right to monitor or to collect and hold and exchange data. It's also suggesting a right to make proposals about cities. So just to say a bit more about then how we went about this project, we worked with community groups who were already doing monitoring in Southeast London, and this is in Deptford and New Cross, where Goldsmiths is based. And then by learning about their activities, we also in parallel made these digital devices which we call the dust box, since they are shaped in a way that particles look under an electron microscope. And you can see it's quite a simple DIY device, and we distributed around 30 of these in Southeast London for people to collect air quality data. And we also had a toolkit for them to be able to analyze their air quality evidence. And so then we worked with people in a series of data workshops to look at the data that they were gathering over time, and then to create narratives about what they were seeing in the urban environment. So we asked people to make observations about various visual evidence of pollution, things they were smelling, various things they heard about, and to report these, and to help us then create these data stories, which would gather their evidence and allow them to communicate their findings to various people, the press, policymakers, and fellow residents in this area of Deptford and New Cross. So we had some quite interesting findings, and before we launched the data stories, we had a launch workshop with residents who took part, and we asked them to think about their kind of proposals for the findings and how they wanted to act on these. But we did find through the citizen data that traffic intersections had significantly higher levels of pollution. In some cases, on the 24 average, it was 6 to 8 times the World Health Organization guidelines. That pollution was made much worse, often by construction activity, and that the River Thames also showed up as a pollution source. And that also a surprising finding was that urban design could make a significant difference in terms of mitigating pollution, since some of the lowest levels of pollution we observed were in gardens in the area. So this was a set of findings from citizen data that is arguably, in some cases, quite different than the findings that you would see in a regulatory data set, which is often working on an annual cycle of looking at pollution. Here we're looking at 24-hour data in a spatially dense network. So citizen data is showing patterns in the city. It's also showing how you might make interventions in the city. So here, a right to data is also a right to intervene in these urban processes and to make proposals for different ways of thinking about traffic and transport, construction and development, green infrastructure, and air quality monitoring. And these are the 4 action areas that we came up with when working with participants when they wanted to make proposals, so that they weren't merely documenting the level of air pollution and saying, here's our alternative data set, we came up with 80 instead of 40, for instance. But by looking at the city in this way and by collecting data through these different practices, they were able to show a different set of processes that were not being captured within the official data sets. So by creating citizen data, it's not merely a matter of having an alternative body of evidence, but it's the different worlds and practices that evidence and those practices can also articulate and mobilize. So what was interesting then about the release of these findings is that it did have a certain amount of press, and the local MP, Vicky Foxcroft, brought these findings to the House to argue for a debate, saying that pollution was significantly higher than the World Health Organization guideline stipulated. But this was sort of brushed off as being something that would just fit within the national policy agenda to look at air pollution, and was sort of put to the side. But what I would argue is that these forums for bringing the citizen data to greater attention are not only limited to the usual way of thinking about where politics takes place. Since citizens did continue to undertake their own projects using the findings to support projects and funding bids, for instance, that this group made to TfL for livable neighborhoods, working with Sustrans to redesign the transport in the area in order to address air pollution, but also to articulate, I would say again here, the right to the city through data. And here you can see they're redesigning the city, bringing some of this air pollution data to bear, and thinking about how to improve walkability, cyclability, and to reduce the amount of vehicle-based transport going on in the area. At the same time, I think there's a significant uncertainty of rights that emerges here. So this isn't just a kind of success story of people using data for funding bids and being able to redesign the city. There are also ways in which, as we've seen with the Parliament example, where the citizen data falls on deaf ears. So here, data citizens are struggling to have their voices heard by engaging in evidentiary techniques, but finding that those techniques are frowned upon, that they're not treated seriously, that their claims to data are rendered suspect through questions of accuracy and so on. So people's attempts to mobilize data can lead to, for instance, the loss of green space here in this same area, people protesting and trying to make claims through their data, and finding that they're not successful, and that not only green spaces, but here in this case, some housing was lost. And so here they're making an appeal not only for a right to housing, but making an appeal to the right to the city and the right to clean air and the right to sustain certain worlds, and not having those claims being heard. So this is a place in which we could bring in, for instance, the arguments of Lauren Berlant, who suggested that there are ways in which the promises of data can also perform a certain kind of cruel optimism, where people think that by gathering just the right kind of evidence and presenting it in the right kind of way, they'll be able to have their voices heard, but in fact, this doesn't happen. And there's a certain kind of injustice that continues to prevail in this sense. So this raises a question about whether by working with data, people are in a way sort of depressive or pessimistic about rights claims, but they're using data nevertheless to try to speak within a language of evidence, but then finding that that also falls on deaf ears. So here you can see people are not only performing protests, but they're also undertaking mapping activities, collecting as much evidence as they possibly can in order to sort of go against the development activities that are taking place here, but finding that these evidentiary techniques are not always resulting in the outcomes that they would like. So this is the space in which I think it would be interesting to end on quite a kind of open-ended way of thinking about how rights are reinvented through data, whether they're reinvented, and just to signal toward this project Data for Black Lives, which is an example of a movement that includes developing alternative data collection and analysis techniques to create new narratives and to demonstrate systemic racism. So using evidentiary techniques and also showing how people are falling outside of the usual forms of data collection and use of data, but trying to use those same techniques to perform kind of counter practices and make data-based arguments that are rights claims, but at the same time using these techniques because they recognize that rights claims are not universally recognized. So this is the kind of point I want to sort of arrive at, that rights claims are things that people are pursuing through the use of data, but through that very use of data, they're also demonstrating how those rights claims are not universal. And so it's a very uneven way in which data is playing out. The data is being mobilized to support struggles because rights cannot actually be called upon in a sort of universal way. So I would suggest here that data citizens are not identifiable through the usual categories of membership or through reference to the usual way of understanding rights as such, through this way of citizens creating their own data, but rather that they're undertaking practices that are forming particular and maybe even new political subjects, relations, and communities, and they're doing this by working with evidence. But evidence does not lead to simply a rosy outcome. It's not as though by collecting even more or other evidence that political nirvana is reached. Instead, this is a way of working in a quite uneven sense with the concrete struggles that people undertake to articulate a right to the city and a right to data, and also to generate more livable and breathable, in this case, urban worlds. So that's I'm drawing on the chapter in this collection that I've contributed, and that's just kind of a gloss on that one argument about rights and data. But also, inevitably, I have to thank the extensive group of people who've contributed to the project, since undertaking a citizen-based participatory study, such as this, is inevitably quite a kind of epic undertaking. So I've just kind of done that, but hopefully you got a sense of who contributed. Thanks very much.
Thank you both for giving really a quick overview of the work you have done, but also laying out the key questions exactly coming from two different points of view. How data politics itself plays out. I have a number of questions and things to be able to say and open up the discussion, but actually our audience, you have been really patient listening to all three of us. I just want to turn to you and then collect some questions that you may have, comments that you may want to offer, and initiate the debate that way very quickly. Any questions, comments? Elke.
Hello. Thank you very much for a really fascinating and interesting talk. I have actually a lot of questions, but I will start with one. And it's maybe, and forgive me, it's a very basic question, but it's one that I kind of grapple with. We talk about data as though it's always something, it's kind of something new that kind of like is just emerged in the digital age kind of thing. But of course, information about ourselves and our persons has always been around. So I kind of want to press you a little bit more on a definition of what is data, right? And what is data about the person? What does it mean to give up data? Right, what's in a private data as opposed to public sphere type of data? Because I think that's a knotty question, right? What is that data, and how is it different in a digital ecology than it perhaps was before, when we stand in the marketplace and people recount about my person to another person? Is that also data that is transmitted to somebody else for a certain purpose? And related to that, is this notion of the algorithmic architectures that are always required when we talk about data, right? That's the next step. So, so it's often said that data is the new oil, but you can't really do anything with just sheer data. It's how it is used and harnessed, and what kind of powers run through the various algorithmic structures that work with the data and that employ the data. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from the panel about that particular question. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Elke. Are there any other questions? I just want to see if we should collect a couple more. Yes, sorry, I don't know your name. Linda.
I think the real battleground for access to data is in what gets set into international trade agreements, so like bilateral agreements and regional agreements, and also in the WTO agreements. And I wondered if your book goes there.
Thank you. One more question, comment? There are enough in these two questions to address. Would you like to start, maybe in reverse order?
Well, I guess I have less to say about the second question. This definition of data is interesting because it, I would say, goes to show, especially with the citizen data collection, how much that designation of data has to do with who's collecting it, how they're using it, what it's operationalizing, and as you say, how it's used in a kind of quite interoperable way
whether we want to make that about the algorithmic architectures or the larger architectures that even go beyond algorithms to networks and so on, that are able to kind of make use of that data. So for instance, when you're working with environmental data, it's quite a different set of considerations that come up than when you're talking about persons. You can talk about some of the same processes that might be worrying in relation to how data operates on the person, and those same kinds of dynamics can be quite useful when you're looking at air pollution data. So there's also kind of tensions that come up around how universal some of these critiques are, depending on the kind of data that you're working with. So for instance, in our case, we're collecting very little personal data as such, but collecting quite a lot of data about what was going on in collective environments because we were monitoring outdoors. But if we had been monitoring indoors, we'd be able to know a lot about people's day-to-day activities, and this is where, for instance, issues around the smart home become quite poignant, because if you're monitoring indoors, you can see when people are around, you can see what their possible activities might be, when they're cooking. You could even begin to see things like whether they're smoking, so if you connect this up with, say, health insurance and so on, as would be a kind of concern in some countries that have private health insurance, you could begin to learn a lot more about a person. So the definition of data and what becomes useful data is really quite situational there. It depends on the practices, the ways that they become interoperable, and how they're used. So that's, I'm finding what, with our work, what became really quite kind of poignant in terms of how that specificity of the uses of data was really quite apparent.
I'll pick up on Elke's point and then I'll come back to your point, Linda. I agree very much. So what is personal data? So my interest is only in personal data. You know, I have huge interests about where different kinds of data intersect, and I have a number of questions I'll come back to for Jennifer in due course. But let me just stick to the one. So we have the classic starting point is, do you have a personal data interest in your name? Okay, and this is by no means a coherent idea across Europe. For instance, you cannot change your surname in Denmark to somebody else's surname unless you get their permission. So you can't just do a deed poll and just start calling yourself something else. You have to get the permission of the person who owns that surname. In the UK, it's a 1066 result that you're entitled to change any name you like, and the only name that sticks with you is your Christian name, because that's the name God knows you by. So it was the whole agreement with the priests that when the census people came around, William the Conqueror's census people came around to do the Doomsday Book, they could call themselves anything they liked, but they had to say the priest would out them if they didn't use the same Christian name that they used, for which they paid the time. So a whole series of intersecting interests around the state extracting income and resources from people according to names. And then we get to very recent cases, and there are a number of decisions from the European Court of Human Rights and more recently the Court of Justice, and recognized by the British courts, that there are different categories of personal data. And some personal data is more sensitive than others. So fingerprint data is more sensitive than your name. DNA data is even more sensitive than fingerprints. So you have levels, and the degree of protection which your personal data should have depends on how sensitive the data is. Sexual preference and religion are also considered very sensitive bits of personal data. So it depends, there are different levels depending on the kind of data which is involved. So we're in a world where, if I could, we could talk about Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, better known as Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to respect for your privacy. And the courts have never defined what is privacy. They've only said this is part of your right to privacy. So it's keeping the doors open for transformation and development. But basically, it's anything that you feel belongs to you, that is part of your identity. the Court of Human Rights has made this weird external and internal identity thing, but I'm going to leave that aside for a moment. Algorithmic uses. The big problem from a legal perspective about algorithms is who's using them and for what purpose, and are they revealing individuals' identities? So, for instance, I don't know about you, but I've got to an age where I now receive almost every other week something from the NHS saying that I've now become eligible for another set of tests to see whether I'm going to keel over something else, which they're sending out on the basis of, and of course, age and where I'm living and availability at the local hospital. Who knows what the criteria are? Anyway, clearly an algorithm is being used through the NHS system to find people like me or people like you. I don't know. I've just got asked for one set where this is designed to help us. And to some extent, I would say, well, did I give all my personal data to my local medical clinic so that the NHS could send me a letter saying, do you want to have a free test on X, Y, or Z? And the bottom line is, well, I don't have to go and have it. If I want to go and have it, I can. And actually, I have quite a bit of confidence in the NHS that if they want to test me, maybe I want to go along and do it. But of course, I don't have to if I don't want to. So I'm not really twitchy about that, but I'm infinitely more anxious if I know that, and this is of course the Windrush, the Windrush fiasco, that NHS Digital was allowing the Home Office to run profiles through algorithms through its database to find people who were having access to the NHS, who the Home Office considered not to have an entitlement from their immigration status, and therefore then sending enforcement round to collect them up the next time they went to the doctor, being refused treatment, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the algorithmic uses depend very much on, is this consistent with what I consider to be the purpose limitation, for my purposes, to Linda. This is the multi-billion-dollar Brexit question, right? Because no, there is nothing in WTO about the use of personal data. Nobody's touched that with the barge pole. And international trade agreements, our current Prime Minister promised us that he would ensure that personal data didn't stop zipping back and forth between the UK and continental Europe under the common protections, the Data Protection Directive and the Data Protection, which applies to the public sector, and the General Data Protection Regulation, which applies to the private sector, that it would all be good and we would have regulatory alignment satisfactory to the EU so that all this data could keep zipping back and forth. But there's no indication that, first of all, the EU doesn't really like the idea of regulatory alignment. They say, well, what do you mean regulatory alignment? What does that mean? And if we want to continue to have data going back and forth with the continent, we're going to have some kind of international agreement, assuming Brexit happens at some point in the future, to enable that to happen. And remember, every time you send an email, that email can go around the world in 100,000 different little tiny bits and then reformulate itself somewhere where it arrives. So data, personal data movement across borders is the norm for an awful lot of personal data rather than the exception. We had a great big agreement, very flawed agreement with the US to allow data to move between the EU and the US, which was based on this whole idea of equivalence, that the Commission said that US data protection rules were equivalent to EU ones. It was struck down by the Court of Justice, and everybody's been jumping up and down and sitting on their hands and trying to figure out what they're going to do ever since. And we still don't have a particularly satisfactory answer to that, but there's probably more detail than anybody wants.
Thank you both. I just want to address one of Elke's questions on what is new about data. This is one of the things actually we address in the introduction to the book. Evelyn and Didier and myself were quite keen on framing the book also a historical perspective on the ways in which data has been a significant aspect of governing modern societies. We, for example, looked at 1820s to 1840s, which by statisticians or historians and statistics called a period of avalanche of numbers in producing data about people, their movements, their health, their illnesses, their movements also within and across borders. So this is 1820s to 1840s. Further back, there was the emergence of a field called political arithmetic in 1650s, which was a significant body of knowledge for imperialism and colonization. Colonization didn't happen without certain imaginary cartographic knowledge about territories, and especially who lived in those territories, who didn't live in those territories, the productivity of those territories. We want to just take a step back and connect the production of data and the relationship between knowledge and power, a historical phenomena, and what does then the current situation tell us, current moment? What is the difference? We didn't particularly use these two terms, but in our discussions now, drawing on from our discussions, two things really struck us as being particularly new about the current condition. One is granularity, and then the other one is ownership. Granularity is about the detailed information now that is available in live time that was never possible before. The amount of data that's generated from not only by the devices that people have always on themselves and in their homes, but also devices that they use to communicate, to produce, to be creative. These are now always connected devices that generate all sorts of information. Universities develop metric information about students using their own platforms to measure their productivity and performance for the good of students. NHS is producing also similarly performance indicators and so on. So the granularity of information that's available and becoming available at the moment in our present has never been possible before. This granularity and the consequences we do not know that such information. Apple, Google can interpolate and triangulate information between people's sexual behavior, their racial and ethnic backgrounds, their political preferences that the states cannot even imagine to have, as Elspeth mentioned, in terms of what public authorities have access. So this granularity is really something staggering. The second aspect of it is that who owns this data? Now, the examples I gave, 1820s to 1840s and 1650s to 1670s, in the very formation of European modern states and European modern societies, the undeniable monopoly over data was by the state. The state produced subjects, produced knowledge about subjects by producing subjects about knowledge. It is that cycle, virtuous cycle, that states render subjects governable and the citizens conforming to that patterns of governability. The relationship between discipline, punishment, and biopower and biopolitics directly contextualize and connected to states' ability to have monopoly over knowledge about subjects. For the first time, as far as we can tell, in history of accumulation and production of data, states are continually, as we speak, losing their sovereignty over that knowledge. Now, Google boasts that it actually knows more about people than any state ever did. Not only that, when you think in terms of what Google, Apple, Facebook know about their subjects as subject peoples, not only over more than what the states are able, but it's transnational. Google's subject peoples counts as about 1.7 billion. No state has ever commanded over such group of subject peoples, as it were. Similarly, Apple has access to data about 1 billion people. Microsoft is about to reach 1.1 billion. And they also carefully guard about what they know about these subjects from each other, in competition with one another over this data. These two things, I think, bring us to a very different moment, a very different constellation of data politics that we haven't had experience of. And we need to make some sense of this, both politically, but also politically and economically. Any other questions? Yes, and with your name, please.
Jennifer. I was very excited for what all three panelists have just said, and it brings me actually to one of my own issues that I'm having in my own research. So I'm hoping maybe you can help shed some light. So one of the things, especially so in listening to Jennifer's talk, I can sort of understand how I can start to think about agency within this sort of phenomenon of or in terms of thinking about the data citizen, because there's a literacy project that's there, and there's a learning and an empowerment. But when we start to talk about the personal data economies, agency and citizenship become quite almost intangible, especially when we start to even think about trust, like how are we supposed to trust? So one of the projects that I'm working on, we're looking at kind of datafication on mobiles, where we're trying to look at the kind of building blocks and how data is actually taken from individuals. And one of the ways and one of the things that keeps coming up is that this is sort of downloaded onto the individual, that they're supposed to have this sort of pre-existing knowledge of this landscape, and therefore they'll be able to make more informed decisions. So when we start to think about power, we start to think about the data citizen, how do we think about this gap of knowledge and agency from your research perspectives?
Thanks, Jennifer. A couple more questions, comments. Rob?
Thanks. We have an election coming up, and obviously one of the changes in election campaigning in recent years has been the use of data to create very individually tailored online political advertising, which is very difficult for other people to track, and it's very difficult to see what kind of election messages are being transmitted. And I wonder, is that something that we should be worried about as Democrats? Or is it actually just part of making democracy more responsive to individuals' wishes and wants and interests?
Thank you. One more question? Yes, please. And your name, please?
My name's Paul. I'm involved this is a different end of the telescope, I think. I'm involved in a political campaign, for the election, just on the outskirts of it. But we were told by the local authority that we can't film our candidate in the public space because of data protection. I can't, so we've lost control of our own public space, in a sense. They can see some reasons for not doing it in certain places, but I just find that interesting perspective, and I felt uncomfortable with that information that you provided. I was curious as to what you thought.
Yeah, it is interesting. Jennifer, Rob, and Paul, 3 questions.
Do you want to go first this time?
I'll go first this time. Agency and personal data economies. Looking at this from a juridical perspective, I always, as soon as anybody says the word trust, I say, what do you mean trust? No, distrust is the basis of any kind of cooperation. Of course, the suspects shouldn't trust the police. Of course, prosecutors shouldn't trust the police. Of course, judges shouldn't trust prosecutors. It just goes up and down the row. And I'm just using the criminal justice system. Of course, we're not supposed to trust our political leaders. We're supposed to distrust them and ask them questions and expect them to come up trumps. So I think we are sold this trust number, which is a very big mistake. And of course, trust, it seems to me, is not necessarily compatible with democracy, which is based on a healthy distrust. So I think that's what I would say about the knowledge agency gap. And I think the other thing I would say about the knowledge agency gap, which is and again this is speaking as a jurist, this is why I wanted to finish off with the comparison with consumer protection. We saw a movement. We saw, hundreds of years of no consumer protection, right? It was really the industrialization of products and their commercialization, which gave rise to the beginning of two ideas. One was tort, let's not talk about that, but the other is consumer protection. The idea that the consumer is entitled to protection, irrespective of having signed the contract that signed away all our rights, right? That those contracts are null and void, they don't exist, because they're not consistent with consumer protection. And I think that example is a very good one for our digital age, because again, we're talking about very, very entrenched economic interests and a huge imbalance of power. Everybody says, oh, it's not possible. Oh, it's not possible. All our companies will go out of business if we have any consumer protection. And yet, through continuous action and agency by our consumers, but they didn't call themselves citizens, but consumers, we did bring to life consumer protection. And as soon as we had it, have we ever been working on making it better and better, right? Whew. It's we now have awfully good toys in this country. On election and data use, I think this is a classic example of the tension between transparency and privacy. Who's entitled to privacy for their personal selves, and where do we expect state bodies, including political parties, to be transparent? And I think exactly the example you're using is a classic of those two becoming merged. And that we're entitled as a political party to set up algorithms through your data without telling you, to try and influence you without you being aware of it. Because this is a protection of our privacy and a protection of your privacy, and transparency is nowhere in line. And I think that's a very, very good example of that. Does the General Data Protection Regulation prevent you filming candidates in public places? I don't think so. Everything that is anti-democratic, someone in a local authority will say it's the result of the General Data Protection Regulation, because they find it a real pain, and so they're trying to reverse it from being something designed to protect you to be something which prevents you from enjoying your rights. So every time you hear that discourse, say to them, would you please show me which provision? And take a lawyer with you. But I mean, this is just so classic. This is the whole move of we hate the EU. The EU is horrible. They've made our lives a misery. We're going to have square tomatoes or whatever it is. And it's exactly that thing. Like GDPR. I mean, I've taught GDPR, for goodness sake. There's nothing there that I see as possible of being construed. The filming a candidate for public office in public space is unlawful.
Yeah, so on the question of agency, I mean, I think this is part of what I find to be one of the kind of really gnarly things that comes up with the use of citizen sensing devices. So when we began studying the use of sensors for people to collect data, it's very much as a research question. It's not as though we were advocating for the use of these devices, but we really wanted to test what sorts of citizenship emerge through the use of these sensing devices and the data that emerges and so on. So the question of agency, hopefully I've given a suitably ambivalent sort of presentation about the sorts of agency that emerge here, because on the one hand it might seem that people are creating evidence with which they can make urban interventions, but then that is very differentially spread, and that can be for a whole host of factors having to do with privilege and access to power centers and who you know and how you're able to kind of leverage your data to get funding for projects and so on. And if you don't have that ability, then you don't have the same weight that you can bring to your data. So I think this is a kind of question that we should raise about having agency and a kind of overly optimistic idea about empowerment be our go-to for the way that we think about data citizenship. Whether I would celebrate distrust, I don't know if I would necessarily go that route, although I do think that is quite interesting, but maybe just step away from questions of trust in that way and think more, I guess the pragmatists would say that communities are the ones that make the conditions of relevance for data. And so maybe we need to be thinking less about what individuals can do and how to out-empower individuals, but what we need to do in a more collective way for thinking about how to work with data, to have data not be something that is used and abused, and also that something that people can use in a way where they could make claims. So that could potentially be attending to the more collective architectures that allow those kinds of things to happen. And so I think with Citizen Sense, we've tried to look at what some of those collective moves might be. For instance, with the data stories, having a whole set of recommendations that people are making as a community, so it feels that it's something that cuts across, although that inevitably is also quite uneven. But I think this question of agency is a tricky one, because as you mentioned, it can often kind of devolve into then this question of literacy. Who's able to collect this data? How does that then create all sorts of gaps in who might be able to contribute? And how could we potentially step away from those problems that come up with literacy as the conditions whereby citizenship can be exercised, and instead look at the kind of collective and communal ways in which that might happen, so that it isn't a kind of neoliberal responsibilization of data citizens. With the micro-targeting, and this is an interesting one, because I've actually had conversations with colleagues about Cambridge Analytica, and they said, well, you know, Obama was doing that first. And so for some people, for instance, people working in these fields, they see these techniques being responded to quite differently depending on who's using them. And so if Obama is doing micro-targeting, people aren't raising the same concerns, whereas if it's Russia or Iran, it's a whole other set of considerations. At the same time, I think there are a set of really worrying dynamics here in terms of how these practices are evolving and emerging, such that there really aren't these collective conversations taking place. So people aren't even necessarily talking about kind of democratic elections in a way that necessarily makes sense within a collective space. People could be receiving very particular sorts of messages, and those messages are coming potentially through very orchestrated means, through very nefarious political channels. So I think there's a way in which micro-targeting itself might not be the technique that we need to worry about, but it is the larger architectures and practices and agents who are involved in those practices that we need to look at, and how to create conditions of accountability, how to, again, return to this kind of collective way of understanding how data is generated and used, so it isn't individualized in these ways. I think that is something that I'm particularly interested in, and I would just underscore your response to the political campaign point, that local councils are likely using this as a stick to beat you with, rather than as something that enables these more collective approaches to data. I mean, that's what GDPR, in a sense, is doing. It's saying we need to look at this problem of data, create a set of collective data practices. They might bed in quite a kind of uneven way. I'm sure there's many people in this room who have sort of wondered about how they're complying or not with GDPR, but nevertheless, it is an attempt to, I think a quite good attempt to try to create conditions whereby we're not entirely subject to the forces of Silicon Valley, and can actually think about data in a more collective way.
I think that's a good point to end our discussion. We have some wine and snacks waiting for us, but before that, please join me thanking our speakers.